Good afternoon, St. Margaret Mary. Father Henry here on this Monday of the fifth week of Easter, here to conclude our series of reflections, our brief series of reflections on true leisure. We began last week discussing this concept by noting that there are three categories of human activity: work, which is characterized by a certain kind of productivity, by producing something, some product, and it's sort of become a god in the modern world. Work for work's sake, work for progress's sake, perhaps. And then there's the second category of human activity, which is idleness, which is a mere absence of work, some sort of passive entertainment or something along those lines, something that's the opposite of work but is geared towards recharging one for returning to work. And the third category of activity is the one that concerns us, and that is the concept of true leisure, which we're going to speak about more today, but which we said was a kind of attitude or a mentality that is the opposite of sloth, that is a kind of interior silence and receptivity, a kind of serenity, a receptivity to being and to the creator and sustainer of all things. In the second talk, we looked to this vice that's opposed to leisure, really perhaps it's idleness taken to its extreme, sloth, and we considered the two ways that this vice, which is ultimately the vice by which we shy away from our true commitment to our Christian baptismal vocation, we looked at the two ways that this manifests itself, which is in a kind of apathetic laziness or lethargy, but perhaps more commonly in a kind of desperate escapism, which we certainly see in a world that has made work into a kind of God. This desperate escapism reveals a deep-seated lack of calm in the soul, and that deep-seated lack of calm makes true leisure impossible. And so today I want to talk about true leisure as a remedy for sloth, and perhaps we might call this talk Rediscovering Authentic Leisure, Rediscovering True Leisure. I've, of course, drawn fairly heavily in these talks on a short work by the German philosopher Josef Pieper called Leisure, the Basis of Culture, which he wrote in 1947. I mentioned the other day also a great book on the seven capital sins, of which sloth is one, called Glittering Vices by Rebecca DeYoung. I highly recommend both of these books. Pieper is a little denser than DeYoung, but they're both great introductions to these things that we've been talking about. So today we turn more specifically to true leisure. Well, let's remember some of the things we already spoke about. It's a mental and a spiritual attitude, perhaps more than a specific kind of activity, a specific kind of task or something along those lines. It's an attitude of inward calm, of interior silence and rest and serenity, a receptive attitude of mind that enables contemplation of creation and the Creator. Leisure is the kind of spiritual attitude that has traditionally been associated with the liberal arts. The liberal arts, those kinds of knowledge, those kinds of human intellectual inquiry that are ends in themselves. They don't lead to a productive tool or a process or a useful product. They're valuable in themselves. St. John Henry Newman, in his famous work called The Idea of a University, he talks about the liberal arts as those that lead one to the top of a mountain to see the whole surrounding view, the whole surrounding vista and territory, such that when one goes back down the mountain to work on some specific spot, on some specific tree or some specific river or whatever, some specific aspect of knowledge, one does not forget the view from the top. All their work will have reference to the whole terrain. This is what the liberal arts are designed to do, to lead one to this view, this vista, and also such that not only does one have the view, but one's heart and mind are raised to the one who created the entire view. So it's not the liberal arts are not characterized by an attitude of active intervention, but of receptivity. Think about it. Allowing the mind to consider a rosebud, or a child at play, or one of the mysteries of the faith, leads to a kind of interior rest. If we're not looking for some sort of specific producible outcome, right? But simply just consider the rosebud, or the child at play, or one of the mysteries of the faith, seemingly inexhaustible. This, of course, is very much characterizes the life of monks in monasteries who live a life dedicated to contemplation, to considering that which is good and true, and of course goodness and truth itself, God. The monasteries were deemed largely useless during the Protestant Reformation. Perhaps part of the reason that monastic life is unattractive to modern young people is because they don't see the point. After all, what is there to do in a monastery? What is there to produce? What money is there to earn? What fame is there to earn? What is there to do? This is interesting, and it reflects a shift in how knowledge was viewed in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Western world began in those times, the 18th and 19th century, to approach the intellectual life differently than it had since the early Christian period, since the Greeks and the Romans as well, all through the medieval period. Knowledge became all about comparing and examining and relating and distinguishing and abstracting and deducing and demonstrating. In short, knowledge became something that was aggressively active in the 18th and 19th centuries rather than something that was passive and receptive. But this, of course, presumes that there's nothing given or inspired about knowledge. It's only my effort that matters, and we know that that's a very modern notion. It's sort of the notion of the more difficult a thing is, the higher in the order of goodness. But that's not true at all. The opposite is the Christian approach. Virtue is not that which is most difficult, but that which is best, that which is good. This tendency of the modern world to mistrust anything that's effortless, anything that we don't have to work really hard for, anything that does not require lots and lots of activity, is part of the reason that we don't have a robust and healthy understanding of true leisure and the intellectual life as a component of the leisurely life. The modern world lives to work. Really, we ought to work to have leisure, to get to that point where we're able to lift our heart and mind to the things above. Part of the reason that we've struggled with stay-at-home orders is that we don't have a healthy understanding of real leisure. And idleness can only go so far before we really get bored. We can only play so many video games or watch so many movies and so on. Those are not bad things in and of themselves, but they're purely passive forms of entertainment that don't really engage the mind, and they certainly don't typically engage the mind in considering the bigger questions of life. So then you might say, well, that's fine, Father. Leisure is an attitude or a disposition of receptivity, of interior peace. But how do I get there? How do I cultivate that disposition? How do I bring myself to have that attitude? Well, there are all types, different kinds of things that can help us develop that disposition. Obviously, meditation proper, when we think about meditating on sacred scripture or something like that, certainly can help. Reading in the humanities, art history, philosophy, theology, history, reading in all of the humanities, the various fields of liberal arts, those fields of knowledge that pursue knowledge that are ends in and of themselves, rather than knowledge that's ordered toward producing something, can all assist in this. Certain kinds of physical activities too, that nonetheless create a kind of space for interior reflection, for wonder and meditation. Gardening, sewing, cooking, carpentry, any number of other things, right? It's not limited to certain types of activities, certain types of intellectual inquiries. Spending time in nature. I think this is part of the reason why the New Agey folks are attracted to the outdoors. They don't really seem to know why. They know that it kind of makes them wonder. It opens them up to something bigger, something beyond themselves. But we do know why spending time in nature helps lift our heart and mind to the things above. Because as the psalmist tells us, the heavens are declaring the glory of God, and the firmament shows forth the work of his hands. Day unto day takes up the story, and night unto night makes known the message. Or as we hear in Daniel chapter 3, all creatures bless the Lord. Sun and moon bless the Lord. Birds of the air bless the Lord, right? Things that open us up to be on the lookout for that which is good and true and beautiful. Things that lead us to wonder. That cultivate a willingness to expect and look for that which is good. These are the kinds of things that help us rediscover leisure. Secondly, true leisure is also an attitude of contemplative celebration. And this is part of the reason that it's so important to reclaim and re-sanctify Sunday and holy days as the Lord's day. You see, true leisure is not a mere pause in work, and the religious celebration is not a mere pause in work. More than that, the feast day or Sunday is time set aside for resting in the Lord. It's a time for festive companionship with God, to use a line from Plato. It's a time most especially for divine worship, for the praise of God, which is done for its own sake, for God's sake, not as a means to an end. All true leisure flows from and back to divine worship. This was something that was really, really important in the fathers, in the writings of the fathers of the church, and for them and for their spirituality. Leisure, properly speaking, is what Sabbath rest is supposed to be about. To restore us to our proper place before God, to contemplate those things most important. Real leisure opens our eyes to new wonders. It ought to move us to wonder. It lifts us above the frontiers of the mundane world to the divine. These are just a few things I think to think about. I hope these 3 talks have provided you with some food for reflection, perhaps a different way to think about the different kinds of human activity, the different things that we do with our time, and perhaps have shed some light on perhaps your own struggle in this time, and have perhaps opened up a vista that you perhaps were unfamiliar with, have given you some ideas about ways to try to rediscover leisure in your own life. Perhaps these talks, I hope these talks, I pray these talks have helped you establish or can help you establish some goals for yourself as we strive to live humanly in this time, as we strive to cultivate the flourishing life of completeness, of wholeness, and of holiness. Until next time, Saint Margaret Mary, may the Lord bless you and keep you.